I'm super excited to share this webinar with you today. My partner Kyle Smith and I dive into actual versus theoretical costing, what it is, how to do it. We go through a real life example, and this is a level, next level layer deep analysis of your cost of goods sold and your numbers. And we've seen restaurants that apply this level of analysis to their business. We've seen them save 10,000 plus a month, improve their margins by that amount. And so this is a very powerful tool, a very powerful analysis that you can do that can have an extreme impact on your bottom line. So without further ado, let's jump in.
All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and just get started here. So thank you very much for hopping on today. We're super excited about the topic we're going to go through. We're going to go through some actual versus theoretical costing for restaurants. This is a next level analysis for restaurants beyond just getting your financials that are going to really help you understand your cost and your usage. And so super excited to do that. My name's Hunter. I'm a CPA, fractional CFO partner at Stratix Accountants with this guy, Kyle Smith. Kyle runs our CFO department and is a restaurant extraordinaire. Grew up in restaurants, family owned multiple restaurants. My personal favorite restaurant ever, Chili's. And so he's been in restaurants for a very long time, and it's going to kind of lead us through this topic. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now, but why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the intro, and what Hunter said, ditto for me, but full disclosure, we never owned a Chili's, owned some other restaurants, but my dad did work for Brinker, which owned Chili's for many years, so I got a lot of free food at Chili's, that's for sure, which was nice.
That's the life.
Yes. Yeah, so like Hunter said, we're going to talk about actual versus theoretical, and the key here is why. Right? Because we know restaurateurs, entrepreneurs in general, but especially restaurateurs have very limited time, and you need to spend your resources, your most precious resource, which is time. You need to spend it doing the things that are going to have the biggest impact. So that is why it's so important to kind of go through the why of why is it worth doing actual versus theoretical, and when, because you can get a lot more bang for your buck in certain scenarios using actual versus theoretical than others. So we can talk about that too. So remind me, Hunter, and definitely we'll stop for questions throughout as well, and make sure that we're answering everything and everybody's following what we're doing. And kind of the structure of this is we're going to talk about actual versus theoretical, why it's important on a high level. Then we're going to go through the traditional setup of setting up sales and cost of goods and getting your cost of goods percentage and doing inventory, basically all of that to make sure that we're on the same page of what a traditional setup looks like for tracking cost of goods in the restaurants. And then we're going to look at actual versus theoretical and how to set that up and the differences and the benefits. So I think we can jump in unless you got
Cool.
anything else,
And
Hunter.
if you do have questions along the way, feel free to just put it in the chat and we'll try to address those as we go.
Awesome. So like I said, we're going to jump into the standard or traditional way of tracking cost of goods, but I wanted to talk about first why, or what is actual versus theoretical and why it's important. So it's when we're talking about actual versus theoretical, it's your actual cost of goods versus your theoretical cost of goods. And all actual is, as everybody knows, it's your actual dollars cost or percentage cost of sales of your sales items. So that's pretty simple. It's what your actual cost is. So when you run a profit and loss statement, It's your cost of goods sold line. That's your actual cost. The key for theoretical is that it's what your dollar cost or percentage cost of sales for an item, it's what it should have been based on the recipe. So if you have recipes built, we know theoretically what the cost should have been based on the item sold. And if you're tracking each thing by item, which is what you do if you're tracking actual versus theoretical, you can basically get the variance between what you actually did in terms of your cost of goods and what theoretically you should have done in terms of your cost based on what the recipes are. So that I'm not going to go into too much detail right now. We're going to go into more detail, but the key there is that you need to be you have to have the recipes built, and you have to have your point of sale correctly depleting items based on sales, so you can get a by item what your cost should have been for any given time period. So once again, that's a big lift potentially if you don't have anything built out in your accounting system or your ERP, your resource system. If you don't have anything built out, that's a big jump to go from 0 to having all of your recipes built. So the question is, why is that worth the effort? Right? And the answer is with actual versus theoretical, if you're tracking that or you have a software that can track it, and we'll go through some different options to use softwares that track actual versus theoretical. With actual versus theoretical, we can isolate usage, and that's critical to making the cost decisions. And so a high level example, say that your cost of goods in 1 month was 30%. Your cost of goods the next month was 35%. And say that you had no targets necessarily set up. The question is, okay, we see it. That's important thing number one, is that you're tracking your cost of goods and you can see that it jumped up. But then the next question is, why did it jump up 5 points from 30% to 35%? And what can I do about it? And, depending on the volume of store or stores, if you have multiple units, that 5% jump could be a very important number. It could be the difference between profit and loss at the bottom, bottom line at the end of the day. You could be a profitable restaurant and it takes you to break even or losing if you had a 5-point cost of goods jump. So that's super material for you, especially if you're working with multiple units and you're buying across units, and you could go from all of your units making a slight profit to all of your units making a loss. So it makes a huge difference. So why would you jump from 30 to 35? Well, there's a lot of possible reasons. One could be input cost, right? Your actual cost that you have to pay for your ingredients could shoot up. And that's completely out of your control. And that's completely, not completely, but it's mostly out of the general manager's control as well. Unless, they're actively negotiating, which they might be. But my point is, input cost could be a cause of the jump. A second cost could be the product mix. So to go from 30% in cost to 35%, you could have sold a lot more items that had a lower margin than you did the previous month. See that happen all the time. That certainly can contribute to a higher cost. And then it could also be usage, which we just talked about, which means you could have, there's two possibilities there. You could have a issue with the recipe where your recipe is not accurate. Or you could have a waste, overuse. And when we're talking about actual versus theoretical, the recipe is more important for this jump of 30% to 35%. When I'm talking about usage, that could be basically waste, which is unlikely, but you could have a big jump in waste, or had to dump a bunch of product. You could have people that are overpouring if it's a bar consistently. That maybe you got new staff and they weren't properly trained up and they were overpouring for the last month, and so your cost jumped up that way. Um, so there's multiple culprits. Once again, you could have input cost, you could have product mix change, or you could have actual usage. If you're not tracking actual versus theoretical, it's basically impossible to answer which one of those is which to make up the jump and then be able to properly address the issue. And we'll go through some specific examples, but it's very, very hard to tell if you're having a jump like that, what part of it's input cost, what part of it is product mix, and what part of it is, usage, waste, overuse. And if you can't isolate them, then you can't take the proper steps because some of it's operational. So if you, if you could isolate it to usage, then you could set targets with your general managers at the stores, and you could start tracking those items that maybe were misused or wasted and really dial in on those and see if you can bring those down. If it's input cost, you'd be working with your suppliers to try to bring your cost down as much as you possibly could. And if it's product mix, you could be fine with the jump if it brought a lot more sales, or you might be looking at that lower margin item that's a really big seller and seeing if there's any lever you could pull, maybe raising the price or changing the recipe. Obviously, you never would want to sacrifice quality, but there's certain levers you could pull there to see if you could save on cost. So if you don't know which one's which, you don't know where to focus your time. And then you're most likely in that case just going to accept that you had a jump and it's just normal. And next month, I hope it goes down. And so that's what we want to avoid, is just hoping. So that's why we track actual versus theoretical, or certainly we recommend it when the timing is right. And yeah, hopefully that's a good explanation of why it's so critical at certain point in the restaurant's journey that you need to move to an actual versus theoretical. Or I would recommend, and certainly we do, that you move to an actual versus theoretical analysis as part of your overall cost of goods tracking and analysis.
Yeah. Yeah. The way I like to think about it is, in your systems, right? Your GM is going in, they're entering your vendor bills for your different food and alcohol costs. Your point of sale is saying, hey, you sold this entree or you sold this drink. And what your system comes up with is, in theory, this is how much these things should have cost based off what your GM entered and what the sales data is. And then what you're comparing it to is the actual count. So at the end of each week, at the end of each month, right, people could be going in and saying, okay, this is how much tequila we have. And then you compare what in theory you're supposed to have, what you actually have. And then if in theory you're supposed to have more tequila than you actually do, okay, there's a usage issue here. And either, like Kyle, you were saying, you have somebody overpouring, maybe somebody stole some, gave it to a friend, whatever the case may be. But without this report, you don't even have the data to be, again, going down the journey of pinpointing, why is my margin ultimately decreasing? Why am I losing money this month? Why is it 30 versus 35? And so I don't know, another way to explain it there, and hopefully that is helpful as well.
Yeah, and just to add one more piece, it's really hard to tell a general manager, hey, your food cost shot up to 35, bring it down to 30.
Yeah.
They're going to be, you know, they might be hitting their head against the wall because there might not be as much that they could do if it was a big input cost jump and they were as tight as they could. They might spend a lot of time in areas where they may not need to be spending time, or them and their team are already doing a good job. So once again, like you said, Hunter, it's super critical to be able to get as dialed in as possible. And we work with restaurants where this analysis just on one item was a 10 grand difference a month in cost of goods. So that's 120 grand a year that is cost that's on the table, that if you can dial in, that once again, that's the difference between breaking even and being profitable. And so that's one of the biggest trees that you can chop if we're talking about, going from big to little in terms of cost items. Yeah, and so
Right.
this what we're going to do now is kind of look at the traditional way of setting up your cost of goods tracking, and then that'll lead into looking at actual versus theoretical. So typically, we set up and let me know if there's any questions or anything you want to add here. But this is Restaurant 101, that you set up your chart of accounts. You create your food costs as a cost of goods item in your general ledger. And a lot of times we're getting much more detailed than that, but just say for the sake of this that you want to create at least food cost and alcohol costs separate, because they're going to have different targets. And if you get more in detail, your sublines in food cost will have separate targets, like dairy, baked goods, depending on what you're offering, those all have different targets. And then obviously your beer, wine, and alcohol will have, beer, wine, and liquor will have different targets depending on, how you're tracking and what, what the item is. So once again, step one is set up your chart of accounts to make sure that you can have categories to track your cost of goods. The second big piece is you need to make sure that you're counting inventory. And the reason to do that is that example that I just gave. Say that your cost, your food cost, or your overall cost of sales jump from 30 to 35%. If you're not tracking inventory, you wouldn't even know that that number was necessarily accurate, because the jump could have been caused by right at the end of the period, or at the end of the month if you're tracking by month, period if you're tracking by period. You could have had a large invoice come in. And if you're not tracking inventory, typically what you're doing is entering your invoice directly to cost of goods. And so the invoice comes in to the restaurant, and you're putting the food cost or alcohol cost, whatever it might be, in as a expense. And so that's going to inflate your expenses. And then what you would do typically is you would track your inventory, you do your inventory counts, and you would back out the difference of the inventory that's on hand, so you could get a consistent apples to apples. So that's why it's super important to track inventory monthly. We would recommend at a basic level for sure. So then you can actually get an accurate cost of goods sold month to month. Because otherwise you're just basing it on purchases. And like I said, that's totally dependent on how much you've purchased, and it would only be accurate if your inventory was 100% equal from month to month to month. And we know that your inventory obviously is going to fluctuate, go up and down based on timing and sales and all that stuff.
What if they felt like that was too much of a burden to count the entire inventory every week or every month? Is there a maybe like a lesser version of this that they can do in order to just kind of begin doing some of this, or what would you recommend there?
Yeah, so one is timing. Weekly is a big ask. There's some folks that count, and we'll talk about it in a minute. What the awesome thing about actual versus theoretical is you can dial in each item you can kind of use separately. So you can pick your biggest volume items, the one that have the biggest impact on cost of goods. And we have, with the stores we work with, sometimes they're counting daily on one item, because we know it's one item that has the biggest impact on their COGS, and they're tracking that one daily to make sure nothing's getting off. So one big benefit of actual versus theoretical. But in the case you're talking about, if you want to do full counts, if you can't do it monthly, I would recommend quarterly, and certainly at least yearly, so you can get an accurate count and know what you have on hand. There's some restaurants we work with that they can't, for separate reasons. Like we have a restaurant that's in an airport, they actually can't get past security except on a quarterly basis to do a full count. So they can only count quarterly. But we recognize that and know that we don't take too much stock when we're looking at a month-to-month cost of goods numbers. We know that there's going to be a range, and so we're not getting too concerned until we can see the quarterly count and get an accurate, true cost of goods number. But that's the first thing I would say is, if you can't count monthly, count quarterly. If you can't count quarterly, count yearly, but try to count. And then what you could also do is count your biggest items. It still won't be 100% accurate, but you're going to get closer there. So if you're a barbecue restaurant, you're definitely counting your proteins monthly, and maybe you do a full count for the rest quarterly. But that way you're at least getting closer and you're able to isolate any big dips or jumps. You're going to know that they're probably closer to accurate because you are counting your biggest cost item in that case. So yeah,
Very
overall,
cool.
I'd say that you have a ton of flexibility there, but it is something that you'd want to devote more and more time for. The more and more inventory that you had on hand, the higher your sales volume, it becomes more and more important.
Yeah. Very cool.
All right. So the traditional way of tracking cost of goods, we talked about this. You're going to get a bill, or what we call in the restaurant industry an invoice, which is backwards from all the other industries. But so you'll get an invoice in from the vendor, and typically you're not going item by item. You're basically just saying, you're kind of grouping them together and saying, okay, here's the food cost total. That goes to the category of food costs. Here's the alcohol cost total, and that goes to alcohol costs. And so basically what's happening is, as the invoices are coming, getting directly expensed. And then what we talked about is, once you take an inventory, whatever the change in inventory is, that amount gets backed out and goes back as an asset because you haven't sold it yet. So it's basically something that's worth money that's sitting on your balance sheet, and it shouldn't be affecting your cost of goods. So that's typically the way it's working. Once again, if that makes sense, as the items are coming in, as your product is coming in, that's getting expensed. And then when you're doing your counts at the end of the month or in the end of the quarter, that's the true up to get an accurate cost of goods, because it's taking away any expenses for items that you haven't sold. That's the traditional kind of flow of invoices and inventory to get a good cost of goods sold number. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but the automation piece is key. So we work with folks that use Restaurant 365. There's other softwares out there, but Restaurant 365 actually has an interface with the big vendors like US Foods and Cisco, and the restaurant general manager is putting their order in as a purchase order, as a PO, and that's created in Restaurant 365 through the food vendors portal. And so basically the invoice is already built by the time that the product arrives. So they're able to enter their invoices by item because they're building the purchase order by item, and then all they're doing is adjusting for what actually came in to the store, and then that invoice is posted. So they don't have to go line by line and build out their invoices in an accounting system. It's basically already built for them. They just need to make any adjustments, make any price adjustments or anything like that, and then post the invoice. So it saves a ton of time if you're doing large orders. So important thing to consider there. Yeah, actually go back 100. I didn't get to see what was on that. Oh yes. So point of sale integration is super important for tracking cost of goods in terms of saving time. So if you have your point of sale integrated, you can enter all of your daily sales because you're mapping everything directly to your categories in your accounting system. So you're not having to do double entry of re-entering all the sales from the POS into the accounting system. It's just happening automatically. So the way it's flowing in is you have sales that are getting populated by the point of sale into your accounting system, and then you're entering invoices, and that's creating the cost of goods, and then you're taking the inventory, and that's adjusting the cost of goods to make sure that it's accurate month to month. So you've got sales coming in and you've got costs coming in, and that is the traditional setup for monitoring and tracking your cost of goods. Does that make sense to you, Hunter? At least
Yes,
if
it
as
does.
I'm explaining it, I want to make sure it makes
Yep.
sense to everybody.
Yeah, and like I was saying earlier, when you use systems like Restaurant 365 or Toast, and Toast has Extra Chef, or I know there's Margin Edge out there. A lot of times it integrates all of these things. It integrates the POS, it integrates the cost data, and then it makes it very easy and automated, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more here in a second. So I don't want to get too far ahead there.
Yeah. And so we just want to include this slide to talk about prime cost, which is really important um, when we're talking about controllables, right? Because that's the biggest thing. If I'm looking at the financials with the general manager, I'm interested in the cost that that person can control. So this is a really good way to do that. It's your cost of goods sold and your hourly labor cost. And if you put those together, there's benchmarks on where that should be. But sorry, I was just looking at a note. There's a benchmark on where that should be, and then you can track against what your individual store targets might be, knowing that the GM can control cost of goods and they can control hourly labor, and those are the two biggest controllable items that we have. And that's critical because then if you have targets set there, those numbers set the tone for the rest of the profit and loss statement and really determine profitability. Because if you're too high on COGS and you're too high on labor cost, hourly labor cost, it's going to be really, really hard to find a way to break even at certain sales volumes because of all the rest of the fixed costs, salaries, rents, depending on the structure that you're going to have to service. And so it's really important to know, where's the target number that we need to hit or at least be above so our restaurant has a chance to break even, week to week, month to month. And it's a percentage of sales. That's the other key, is that when we're looking at prime cost, it's variable, dependent on sales, not 100%, but pretty darn close. It's dependent on sales. And so we're always looking at the target as a percentage of sales.
Yeah, I mean, basically, again, like I was saying, is you're isolating the things that you can have the most control over. So your direct input costs, the food and the alcohol, and your hourly labor, which oftentimes is made up of the back of the house labor that is making the food. And so you're really focusing on what are the biggest items on my P&L that I can have the most control and influence over so that I can just move the percentage points little by little to the point of break even profitability and where I need to be.
100%. So related to that, we were just thinking, wanted to provide a couple of benchmarks of where you would typically be, and these tons of caveats because it's always super dependent on the things that we talked about. Even product mix at the same store would change your target food cost percentage from month to month, which once again, that's another reason why having the additional tool of actual versus theoretical is so important for diagnosing the why food costs changed. But typically you'd want to be in that 28 to 35% range, and sometimes it's lower if you're over 35%, it's pretty tough. Certainly not impossible. But that would be just a benchmark range of where you'd be on food costs. And then alcohol cost is typically lower, 18 to 25, and hopefully 20% and below is what I usually like to see for a store that's buying alcohol and not making it. If you're making beer, your food cost or your cost is like 6% and selling it out of the tap room. So that's why you see a lot of breweries, because that's pretty darn attractive. But if you're buying alcohol, yeah, typically in the 18 to 25% range. All right. So this is the big next step. So you're a store that's tracking, you've got your point of sale system integrated, and so you're getting sales data in on a daily basis into your accounting software. Your GMs or your accounting team are doing a good job of entering the invoices into the system, so you're getting cost of goods entered as quickly as possible. And so now you're getting sales and you're getting cost, and you're able to at least get an accurate cost of goods number on a monthly basis. And so it goes back to the example that we talked about at the beginning. From one month to the next, let's say your cost of goods went from 30% to 35%. So you can start narrowing down the causes of that. So one, did you take inaccurate inventory? If you verify yes, then you know that, okay, that 30% and that 35% are probably pretty accurate. Then you're checking, maybe going back into your invoices and checking, did we misenter an invoice? Did we put something in a wrong period? Something like that. That would affect the 30% number and the 35% number. Once you verified those things, that kind of the nuts and bolts are accurate, that you've got all of your invoices received into the right period, you've got them with the rights, and that all your sales are in for both months. So you're not missing sales, you're not missing invoices, your inventory is accurate. At that point, this is where we'd want to look at the actual versus theoretical cost, because now we can narrow it down to, it's got to be input cost, it's got to be product mix, or it's got to be usage. And what the actual versus theoretical does is it dials out the product mix and the input cost, because you're looking at your theoretical by item as a total. So it's basically saying we're assuming input cost is what it is. And so basically you're setting that aside. If your input cost went up, that's a separate issue to address. What the actual versus theoretical is doing is showing how good did your team manage against the recipes. So the first key there is that you've got to track everything. You've got to build your recipes. And so you've got to have a system to be able to build recipes. Extra Chef in Toast is an example. What we work with a lot is Restaurant 365. And what you're doing is you're building recipes for everything that you're selling. And those recipes are built with items that have costs. So if you have everything built, then basically you can map the POS. So with Restaurant 365, say you have all your recipes built in Restaurant 365, the point of sale system, the sales come in, and those sales basically are by item. So we can then deplete all of our inventory in Restaurant 365 by item, and that creates cost by item, if that makes sense. So before, traditionally, you're taking your cost when you're entering your invoice, you're creating your cost. because you're entering your invoice and you're saying all of these go to alcohol costs, all of these go to food cost. With actual versus theoretical, the sales are determining what your cost is. So the sales come in and the system can see, okay, the sales are involving these items and they're part of these recipes, or the recipes that build up these items are going to deplete these individual raw ingredients. And so it's pretty technical, but basically the system is kind of working backwards in that your sales are driving your cost of goods in real time. So you're not dependent on waiting for sales to come in or waiting for inventory necessarily, because you can track uh, based on depletion. So a sale will deplete your inventory and it will create your cost. And then if you're taking inventory, if you're doing a key item count, for instance, once a day, you can track these things daily and you can see if there's a big variance between what got sold and what theoretically should have been costed and what it actually costed, as long as you're taking an inventory and you can take an inventory up to daily. So, but with worst case with actual versus theoretical, you can start getting costs on a daily basis and start making decisions daily instead of having to wait weekly or monthly. So that's a really big advantage. And so we talked about the how you do this. You've got to have a system to track and create recipes by item. Your point of sale system has to map sales and costs by item. And so that can be a big lift. But it also depends on how complex what you're selling is in terms of your recipes. If you don't have a lot of things that you're selling, it's going to be pretty simple and you can be able to keep up. Once you have it set up initially, it's going to be pretty easy to keep up, because you just need to make sure if you have a new item that you map it in the point of sale system. If you don't have new items very often, then you don't have much need for it. We work with a restaurant group where they have one person who's their purchasing person. Is also in charge of making sure that all the recipes are up to date and making sure that new items in the point of sale system are mapped. So he's not actually doing that, but he is reaching out to the general managers, reminding them that if you create a new item in the point of sale system, you need to let him know about it, so then he can double check that it's mapped correctly and that we have a one-to-one, because that's the one key. And once again, you can focus on the biggest items. So you can start doing this. You don't have to have everything accurate, but you focus on the biggest cost items. And I have a quick example there. We work with a bar basically where their biggest item is a house liquor. So the first thing that we did is say, instead of, hey, let's look at every single item to make sure that the recipe is correct, because we have variance in actual versus theoretical cost, we said, let's focus on the biggest moving item and make sure that all the recipes that include that item, which would be basically all of their different mixed drinks, margaritas, that would include that key house liquor, we made sure that all of those recipes were correct. So then what we can do is make sure that that actual versus theoretical for that one item is correct. And that one item was plus or minus 10 grand a month in variance. So we were then able to isolate that and bring it down to close to zero, which saved them, close to 10 grand a month, just because we picked the biggest item. So that's the key, is don't get overwhelmed with getting everything perfect. Why would you spend time on something that is only a couple $100 a month in sales if you have something that's $100,000 a month in sales? Make sure that that item is correct and that the recipes are all correct for that item. So then you can track your actual versus theoretical. So what we talked about, just to recap, traditionally you're just tracking your cost of goods and it's going up and down and you're not really sure why. So we are saying, if you take the extra step of tracking your actual versus theoretical, which does involve some front end work, you've got to set up your recipes and you've got to have a system that can track and set up those recipes. But once you do that, then you can start, and we're going to show an example of what an actual versus theoretical looks like once you have it set up. And so once you've done that, you can basically isolate what's controllable, because we're throwing out input cost and product mix, and we're just saying, what can the general manager control? So for one item, say for instance, liquor, like we just talked about, if one big house item, liquor item, just one specific item is your biggest mover, now you can isolate that item and see, controlling on the ground, are they using it correctly to the recipe? And so then you can have the discussion of, hey, look, this recipe is not correct. We need to adjust the recipe. So then you can go in and adjust all the recipes that involve that item. And then the next month, there's nowhere to hide, because we just verified the prior month that the recipe is correct. So if there's any variance left, it's got to be usage. So there's something happening in the preparation of the drink, if we're talking about alcohol again, or there's a waste somewhere in the process, and that's where now you need to dig into the operational issue and make sure that you're efficiently preparing that drink or preparing that food item correctly to the recipe. And that is the whole key, because then you can start actually making decisions to save money instead of just taking a guess.
Yeah. It's meant to produce an actionable step to actually improve your business and improve your margins.
Well, you want to go back and show, yeah, perfect. So just wanted to show everybody what's possible when you do the front end work. And we talked about the when to do this. So obviously the size of your restaurant or restaurants in terms of sales volume matter, because the more sales you do, that means the more cost of goods dollars you're going to have, and the bigger variance there can be from one month to the next. It wasn't a group that we worked with, but a group that Restaurant 365 works with. They found a $240,000 a year item. They were able to save with one item tweak. They were able to save a pizza. It was a pizza franchise with like 200 plus locations. All the locations were buying cheese separately. And so there was massive cost variances. They were able to identify that and pick the single lowest volume, the single lowest cost cheese provider. They were able to negotiate a better rate with them, and all the stores used that rate, and they were saving $240,000 a year. So that's where actual versus theoretical can be super, super useful. But even on a much smaller scale, it's worth looking at if your jumps in COGS are, one, not explainable, and two, are starting to be material to your bottom line. So like I said, if that 35% jump month, you're not able to explain why your food cost is going up and down, or your total COGS, your total cost of sales is going up and down. And it's meaning the difference between profit and loss for you. So if it's a 5% jump and you're not able to explain that, I would say that's definitely the time to look at implementing a theoretical, actual versus theoretical system, or looking at systems like Extra Chef or Restaurant 365 that can help implement that and can do it pretty efficiently from a dollars perspective. And then you just need to understand the time commitment, but the outcome can be very, very worth it in those circumstances. So anyways, we're looking at an actual versus theoretical analysis from Restaurant 365. So you can see there's quantity and dollars, and I'll focus on the right side here for dollars. And you can see in column AF, in AE, there's the actual in terms of dollar usage, and then there's the theoretical. And then there's the variance in column AG. So you can see very easily, we can say there is we know it's not input cost related and it's not product mix related. there is 125K variance between what we should have spent and what we actually spent in our liquor for this time period. And so then we can start diving in and seeing where the biggest variance is. And then the next step is going through the recipes and saying, are the recipes correct or not? But this is really where it's efficient because it puts it on your GMs and your team that's looking at purchasing, or if that's all you, then it's all you. But either way, that's putting it to you guys, your team, to say, hey, are the recipes correct? And then once you've identified those key items and identified that the recipes are correct for those items, you can go back and know that now it's down to operational, and you can make sure that and then we talked about at the beginning, making sure that their GMs are spending time where they can control. We know once we've isolated that you've got a controllable difference that's operational, that's related to usage, that your team needs to control. And Hunter just highlighted tequila. That's exactly where I would go. Is why is tequila 91? That's where we should focus. And I'd find the biggest item within tequila and focus on that. And we've done that exact thing with restaurants that we work with. And like I said, it can make a 5-figure a month difference. But you can see that's why it's so useful, because from a high level, I can come in, if I'm not at the stores every day, I can still come in here, isolate what's big. I can get with the general manager, I can get with purchasing or the person that's handling the recipes, and we can start taking steps to addressing this variance and bringing it down.
Very cool. Well, appreciate y'all hopping on today. That was a lot of information. All right. The big thing we want to leave y'all with is when you see fluctuations in your numbers, there is a way to dive in that much deeper. If you're at all confused about where to start there, or you have questions on anything we covered today, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to help, love to just have a conversation, see if we could at least point you in the right direction. But again, thank you guys very much for hopping on. Appreciate it.